He was the most notorious and infamous king to have ever ruled over England, and he had a list of victims that even included 2 of his wives who lost their heads inside the walls of the Tower of London. Henry VIII's story, in the canon of English history, is intertwined with the fate of his 6 wives, and his brutality in regards to how he turned on some of his closest friends. There is no denying that Henry possessed some evil, tyrannical characteristics in his personality. For example, he even ordered a cook and a woman to be boiled alive for their involvement in alleged poisoning plots. But what is not so well documented is the fact that the king experienced a significant amount of heartbreak and turmoil with regards to the deaths of his own children. Many of his children died in tragic circumstances, and these failed births led to the downfall of his wives. In this documentary, we will look at the different children of Henry VIII, their stories, and their tragic demise.
There was a great hope across England when Henry VIII's legitimate son Edward was born, but his birth and life would be tinged with sadness and tragedy. Shortly after the heir to the throne was born, Henry VIII's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, died from childbirth-related issues, but it was hoped that Edward VI would reign over England for decades, and that his future children would secure the Tudor throne for centuries. This would not happen, and Edward VI did not really rule in his own right and power, as he would die at such a young age, and it was clear that the king was very sick. It was noted that on the 15th of February 1553 that the king was very ill, as he was feverish, and his elder sister and woman, who would later dethrone his successor, came to see him shortly before he died. But what is the story of the death of Edward VI? Edward was born on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, and there was a huge degree of celebration across the country. The news of a male heir and son being born was cheered across England, and Henry VIII was ecstatic with the news. In churches, hymns were sung, and in streets bonfires were lit, and there was a huge degree of happiness for the king and Jane Seymour. But Edward VI's mother, Jane, would recover well to begin with, but she fell ill on the 23rd of October 1537, and she would then succumb to postnatal complications. The happiness and joy of Edward VI's birth was dented with the grief for his mother, and the woman who gave birth to the heir. Edward himself was a healthy boy, and his father Henry VIII was very happy, and he was overjoyed. Henry kept a close eye on his upbringing, and he regularly looked after his son and played with him, and Edward was a strong and healthy young boy. He was tall and happy, and there was a belief that he was sickly, but this was not true, and his first few years were very healthy. But when he was 4, he did suffer from quartan fever, or malaria, but this did threaten his life, and Edward did suffer with poor eyesight. However, then Edward did get better, and he was healthy until the final few months of his life, but he was given the best education that his father could find, and Edward himself was highly intelligent. Now, in the eyes of the people of Tudor England, Edward would grow into a brilliant king, and he was given the best start. He would be visited by his half-sisters Elizabeth and Mary often, and he would also be close with Henry VIII's 6th wife, Catherine Parr. The other children visited Edward to play, but he was more interested in his schooling, and he was motivated by the fact that he was the heir. It's believed that even as a young boy he knew what would be asked of him. But on the 1st of February 1543, Henry VIII would sign the Treaty of Greenwich, and this was an attempt to bring peace between England and Scotland. But with this it was proposed that Edward, the heir of England, married the 7-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots. The Scots refused this and allied themselves with England's enemies, and the king then rampaged into Scotland and ordered Edward's uncle to invade and burn Edinburgh and to sack the Scottish lands. Edward's father's health was rather poor in the early 1547, and inside of the Palace of Whitehall he died. Edward was just 9 when he was crowned King Edward VI at Westminster Abbey, and a regency council was set up to help him rule, headed up by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. There were 16 people who would help the young boy rule, and Edward, being king, was now given the best food in England, and his health was monitored by the best doctors that England had. They checked his temperature daily and worried about his food, and Edward was well fed and was rather tall for his age. It was written how Edward's posture wasn't great, and that he may have had scoliosis of the spine, and he had one shoulder which was lower than the other. In 1550, Edward VI was stricken with a mysterious illness, which was serious, and the royal doctors were concerned, as it looked as if he would not pull through this. But he did recover, and the illness was kept a complete secret. But this was the start of the king's real shift in health. In the spring of 1552, the king contracted another illness, and this was deadly. He caught measles and also smallpox, but he again recovered. He was said to have been wearing glasses at this time, and also he was a little deaf. But in the December of 1552, things were getting much worse for the king's health. He began to show signs of tuberculosis, and the measles infection wreaked havoc with his immune system, and he then caught TB. On the 15th of February 1553, it was said that Edward was sick with a feverish cold, and Mary, his elder sister, came to see him. But during the meeting, he was bedridden, and he had a terrible and violent cough. There were many rumours that the king had been poisoned, but things were kept quiet still. His symptoms were very complicated and diverse, and the best doctors were brought in to treat him, and a mysterious woman said that she could cure the king. She was let into the king's rooms, and Edward VI was given a potion that nearly killed him and caused the king's limbs to swell. But on the 17th of March 1553, things then went very downhill. He may have been a strong boy before, but he was reduced to being a thin and gaunt boy who was stuck in his bed, and the doctors believed he was approaching death. In April of 1553, it did seem to get better, and he went for a walk in a local park, and he was sent to Greenwich to recover, as it was said that the air was better. He was spotted in the garden, and he was getting weaker, but he now was coughing up blood, and this was not good. Edward was still predicted to have made a full recovery, but doctors thought he was suffering from a tumour which was based in his lungs, and that this was causing his high fever. His stomach was also really swollen, and his body broke in sores and ulcers, and the doctors were not happy with this condition. On the 17th of May, the king met with the French ambassadors, and he was very weak, but by the end of the month, Edward was going downhill rapidly. His body became very swollen, and his head and feet were swollen largely, and opiates sent him to sleep. But the changes were then made to his succession. However, on the 10th of June 1553, doctors predicted that Edward had at most 3 days to live, and doctors believed that it was it. He could not eat any food, and he had a fever that did not get better. On the 15th of June, he had another incredibly high fever, and this came back days later, and Edward was now incontinent, and his bowel movements were terribly smelly. His legs continued to swell, and he could only lay on his back, but the young boy's nails and hair were now falling out also, and the last few days were horrific. On the 1st of July, Edward VI was spotted by a crowd at a window, and the king was very sick, but then his final moments would come less than a week later. On the 6th of July 1553, at around 8 or 9 in the evening, Edward VI died in the arms of Sir Henry Sidney. His final words were, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." There were many doctors that were also there, and following his death his surgeon opened up his chest, and it was found that his lungs had 2 ulcers on them, which were infected. Many of Edward VI's symptoms and last moments allude to the fact that he did die from tuberculosis, but a number of historians believe that the contemporary opinions of Edward's deaths was that he died from the disease too, but some claimed he had a pulmonary infection or a lung abscess. However, Edward's death was rather brutal and horrific, and he suffered heavily, but he would be buried on the 8th of August 1553 inside of Westminster Abbey, and he was buried in an unmarked grave inside of the Lady Chapel alongside his grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. One of the most savage queens to have ever ruled England was Mary I. She became known as Bloody Mary, as she burned over 200 Protestants at the stake during her short 5-year reign of the country. She was the eldest child of King Henry VIII, and many believed that she was as brutal as her father could be. But she was a woman who was driven by her religious convictions. She was also a very sick woman, and throughout her life she encountered a number of health problems that led to her dying at the age of 42. One of the biggest issues that plagued Mary was her inability to become pregnant, and she blamed Protestants on this, and that's why she punished them extremely harshly. But on the 17th of November 1558, inside the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, Mary I died, and it would be her half-sister Elizabeth who would succeed her. But what is the story of the death of Mary I? Now Mary wrote in 1552 to the council of her half-brother, King Edward VI, and she said, "My health is more unstable than that of any creature, and I have all the greater need to rejoice in the testimony of a pure conscience." It's likely that Mary's health throughout her life was impacted by the huge amount of stress she was put under, even during her early life. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was the first wife of King Henry VIII, and she had a sharp but very distressing downfall. Henry VIII, Mary's father, had fallen for Anne Boleyn at a much younger woman who served as Mary's lady-in-waiting. However, he needed a petition to Rome to get a divorce. This would not be granted, and Henry later decided to declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and banished Catherine, Mary's mother, from her household. Catherine was banned from seeing Mary, her daughter, and the pair would not see each other again. Catherine of Aragon was heartbroken by being prevented from seeing Mary, and this caused her great upset. But Mary was profoundly affected by this. She lived on a diet of stress and nervous tension, and this did not make her very well. She was a thin and frail lady who had red hair and very fair complexion. She allegedly had a loud and deep voice and was rather short-sighted and struggled to see. She also had her father's temper and could be very stubborn. It's believed that as an infant her health was nothing out of the ordinary, and she lived a comfortable life in the royal nursery and was given a brilliant education. But in Spain, 1528, she suffered from a bout of smallpox, but emerged from this rather positively. It wasn't recorded that she was scarred from smallpox, unlike her half-sister Elizabeth I was, but when she entered puberty around the age of 14, Mary began to suffer greatly. She complained of many pains from her head and also her stomach, and there were many occasions where she constantly was sick for periods of up to 2 weeks. She could not keep any food down, and as she was Henry VIII's daughter, the best royal doctors would tend to her, and different physicians and apothecaries were brought in to treat her. Mary was diagnosed with something recorded as strangulation of the womb, and this had a number of symptoms, including issues with her periods, a depressed mental state, issues with breathing, and pain and swelling of the abdomen. Because of this, she also suffered from headaches, lack of appetite, fainting, nausea, and vomiting. This was all incredibly stressful for the young girl, who was having to deal with much despite being a young girl. She had also been written out of the line of succession, which would have affected her. By right, she should have succeeded Henry VIII, but she was written out because of the dissolution of Henry's marriage with her mother. Mary later went to live with her half-sister Elizabeth, and as part of her treatment she often rode on horseback, but she was then in a sense kept under house arrest, as the Act of Succession banishing her from the throne was passed. She was practically held under house arrest, and Mary was ordered not to call herself a princess or label her mother as a queen. And she was threatened with execution and a stay inside of the Tower in London if she did this. However, weeks before her 19th birthday, she became very ill. She was placed under the care of Lady Shelton, whose treatment of her in a sense was very harsh. Mary had headaches and stomach cramps again, and Lady Shelton fetched an apothecary who was new in. She was prescribed a number of pills which actually made Mary much worse, and they made her fight for her life. She could have had an allergic reaction to what was inside of them, or some response which placed her body into a state of shock, but Lady Shelton was worried that she would be accused of trying to poison the king's eldest child, and she worried that she would go to the executioner's block.
Even some of the royal doctors refused to treat her, as they did not want to be blamed or linked to her death if she died under their charge, but Thomas Cromwell then sent the king's personal doctor, Dr. Butts, to see Mary. He said that her illness was curable and that she needed to take a course of careful treatment, and that if she had been living in better conditions, then she would have been healthier. Henry refused to relent, but Mary did get better. She was given a special diet and she then did recover, but her illness showed no pattern, and each time she was poorly, the severity of symptoms changed. Many across the land learned about her illness, and European princes and monarchs were hesitant to ask the king to marry Mary, for her health would be such a burden to them. She wrote to Cromwell again and complained again of more issues with her stomach and head, but she did return to her father's household, and she served as the chief mourner for Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, at her funeral. But she had very bad toothache, and this was then pulled out. She was severely ill in the winter of 1557, and she was so sick that she could not stand or sit for long, and she became very faint. She also then, a few years later, had a fever that caused her heart palpitations, and she was so ill that many thought she was on death's door. It took her a while to recover, but she got there. She would accompany Henry VIII and his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, on their honeymoon, but she then got sick and returned back for the comfort of home. She experienced more fever in 1547, and her mood and mental state got much worse. After her father's death and the accession of Edward VI, Mary was stressed yet again. She, as Catholic, was worried that her half-brother, who was Protestant, could have her killed, and she lived under the constant fear of imprisonment. But Mary would become queen herself, after deposing Edward's successor, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. But she then married Philip of Spain on the 25th of July 1554, which did not go down well. People across England feared his Spanish influence, but the most tragic bout of illness would then strike Mary. After the wedding, at the age of 37, she announced she was pregnant. Mary's health got better during pregnancy, but she then went into confinement at Hampton Court. However, there was an announcement on the streets on the 30th of April 1555 that she had given birth to a child, but this was a mistake, and the doctors said there was a miscalculation of her due date. Mary said she was pregnant and insisted on this, but she became very reclusive. Not many courtiers and attendants believed her, and those who waited on her said she looked pale and ill. But she later came round to the fact there was no child, and then the swelling of her belly went down. This was a phantom pregnancy, and Philip then left England to leave Mary to rule her kingdom. He did return, but Mary was yet again ill, with insomnia and melancholy. It was said that the stress of her life made her look 10 years older than she was. But when Philip left England for the last time, Mary believed she was pregnant again, and her stomach was swollen. Mary recovered, but in the January of 1558, England lost Calais to France, and there was great famine across the country, as weather was awful and had ruined crops. There was also a terrible bout of flu which was sweeping through England and was killing people at the same rate as the plague. This illness was one that lingered on, and then the victim would often die. In spring and summer of 1558, Mary was sick again, and in the August she had a low fever and dropsy, and it was said she was in a very bad way. The royal doctors predicted that she would die. Because of this, she moved from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace. Then by September of 1558, Mary had a high fever again, confusion and also headaches, and she then went almost completely blind. She had a fever which would last days, and more bad moods made her feel worse. But by October, it was clear she would not recover, and she made her will. Mary tried to do what she could to rule England, but it was clear to everyone she did not have long left. In early November she did seem to get a little better, and she then named Elizabeth, her half-sister, her successor. She then drifted in and out of consciousness and would wait for her death. She got very weak, and many of her household staff switched to go and serve Elizabeth I to try and secure a place in the new Queen-to-be's household. But some servants stayed loyal to Mary, and they tended to her in her final moments. She prayed for her salvation,
and she described these incredible dreams she was having whilst she was unconscious. She said she saw angels before her, and this gave her comfort. She heard Mass in the early part of the 17th of November 1554, but then she died peacefully between 4 and 5 in the morning. There have been a number of suggestions as to what killed Mary, and one of them is that she suffered from ovarian dropsy. This condition is where cysts form on the ovaries, and it creates terrible abdominal pains and swelling, and it can be linked to the growth of cancerous tumours. Another theory that had been put forward is that she suffered from a tumour of the pituitary gland, and it was said that some women diagnosed with this can have problems with depression, bleeding, and issues with stomach pains. But it has also been suggested that the violent bout of flu which was sweeping through England could have caused her death. But Mary I was a queen who, despite reigning for just 5 years, had a huge impact on the landscape of England. She restored Catholicism briefly and launched a campaign of persecution against her enemies. One of the most brilliant and spectacular monarchs to ever have ruled over England was Queen Elizabeth I, and during her reign it was said that there was a golden age across the nation. But despite Elizabeth's time on the throne bringing a number of positives to England, she was a woman who could be ruthless and violent herself. Elizabeth I was a queen who said she was married to her nation and country, but she was not afraid to make decisions that would send people to their deaths. She executed Mary, Queen of Scots, an anointed Scottish monarch, and her cousin, who served as a threat to her. This would haunt Elizabeth even on her deathbed. But Elizabeth I's demise and death was one which was a long departure from her spirited and positive former self, and the Queen suffered greatly with depression in her final days. But what is the story of the dreadful death of Queen Elizabeth I? Elizabeth I was the final Tudor monarch, and she did not have any children, leading to a problem about who would be the king or queen after her. Decisions were made to approach the Scottish King James to become James I of England, and he did accept this. Interestingly, James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the very woman that Elizabeth I executed. But medical treatments, even for the wealthy and the royals during this period, were still very poor, as doctors were considered quacks and they were using medieval remedies and treatments such as bleeding and purging. But Elizabeth I was not always an image of Gloriana, and she was sick a number of times throughout her life. She suffered from the deadly diseases of smallpox, and with this she was left scars on her face. These concerned her greatly, as she worried about her beauty, and she was concerned that these blemishes and problems would lead to her not finding a husband. She even ordered painters to paint over the scars and to make the images of her without them. But as she aged, she was not an image of youth and beauty anymore, and one ambassador who visited her court noted that her teeth are very yellow and unequal. Many of them are missing, so that one cannot understand her easily when she speaks quickly. But Elizabeth I reigned for around 45 years, which was a huge achievement during the Tudor period. In her final years, she became very depressed and sad, especially as many of her close friends and ladies passed away. In 1590, Blanche Parry, her closest lady-in-waiting, died, and Parry was the chief gentlewoman of the Queen's privy chamber, and was also said to have been the keeper of the Queen's jewels. She had known the Queen since she was just a child, and she did everything that Elizabeth wanted, and Blanche Parry was seen as a baroness, and her death hit Elizabeth incredibly hard. But then in 1598, another one of her closest friends and her most senior advisors, Cecil, died. He had been by the Queen's side throughout most of her reign and through many different tough times, and had supported her even when she was young. The deaths of these people that the Queen had held in deep regard hit her hard, and then she became more withdrawn and reclusive, but she still served with ruthlessness. She oversaw the execution of her former favourite, Robert Devereux, a man who many believed could have possibly been a husband for Elizabeth,
despite the rather large age gap. Devereux had been convicted of high treason for his rebellion and insurrection, and he was deemed as a traitor, and he lost his head on Tower Hill in front of a large crowd. But in the January of 1603, Queen Elizabeth I was not very well, and she was not in a good mood at all. The Queen retired to Richmond Palace, which was one of her favourite homes, and this was a place where she felt very comfortable, and in her final months and days she surrounded herself with her loyal ladies and other attendants. She turned her back on food and drink, and also lost a lot of weight, and Elizabeth's ladies then became very concerned about her. They knew what was on the horizon, and despite appealing to Elizabeth to allow doctors into her quarters, Elizabeth refused any treatment. But another death also caused further upset, as Catherine Howard's death hurt the Queen, and she was a woman who had served Elizabeth for 45 years, and she died very suddenly. This may have been the final nail in the coffin of the last Tudor Queen, and it was said regarding this that the Queen loved the Countess well, and hath much lamented her death, remaining ever since in a deep melancholy that seemeth to be overtaken. But in the February of 1603, Elizabeth I remained in this very severe depression, and she was no way near her former self. Elizabeth was the Queen who had defeated the Spanish Armada and inspired her nation to victory, but now she was vacant most of the time, and she was approaching 70 and was very frail. The Queen continued to refuse to rest when she attended court, and her ladies were concerned that she would fall, so they laid pillows all over her bedchambers in case she did have a fall. There were more deaths of her ladies, including Lady Knollys and also Catherine Grey, the Countess of Nottingham, but Elizabeth had enough of life. She was constantly upset, and in the March of 1603 she fell sick herself. She would sit on her cushions for hours on end, motionless and in deep thought, and she was pondering her life during these episodes and moments, and she may have been regretting her decisions to carry out the executions of some of her favourites, and in particular Mary, Queen of Scots. It was said that Elizabeth never truly wanted to execute Mary, her cousin, as she believed this would have prevented her from getting into heaven, executing another woman, who would have been sent by God to rule over her kingdom. If she hadn't have done this either, there was a good chance that Mary could have become the Queen of England. One witness said that the Queen shed many tears and sighs, maintaining her innocence, that she never gave consent to the death of that Queen. Elizabeth was even visited by ghostly figures and was haunted by people, including Mary, in her final days. But to everyone, in the March of 1603, it was clear that this would be the Queen's final illness. Her depression, along with her delirium and her overall health, all continued to decline and frail. She took to her bedchambers, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was then summoned to come to her bedside and to pray for her. He told Elizabeth not to worry about the afterlife, and he said that she would go to heaven and she would be looked after by angels, reigning once again in the afterlife. But on the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I passed away inside of Richmond Palace. Her body was taken to Whitehall, where it was then held in state, but a number of Elizabeth's final wishes were not adhered to. Elizabeth stipulated that she did not want to be embalmed and eviscerated with her heart and her internal organs removed from her body after death, but this did occur, and it was possibly a good job that this did happen, because when her coffin was moved there was a very loud crack that was heard from within it, and it was claimed that her body broke open as various gases were released from her decaying corpse. But the explosion even splintered her coffin and some of the wooden shell, and this would have been worse if she hadn't have been disemboweled. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth I occurred on the 28th of April 1603, in which she was laid to rest inside of Westminster Abbey. The funeral procession was huge, and thousands of people came onto the streets of London to pay their last respects. It was said by a witness that there is such a general sighing and groaning and weeping, as the like had not been seen or known in the memory of man. She was a woman who was loved by her people, and she had a very interesting reign over England. Elizabeth I, to begin with, was laid to rest inside of the same vault as her grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. However, she was later moved by James I to be buried inside of a huge tomb that had been made for her, and is laid to rest opposite Mary, Queen of Scots, her infamous rival.